No one noticed the man at first. And that was the cruelest part of his existence, because invisibility is not something that happens suddenly, but something that settles slowly into the bones, and he had been disappearing for years without realizing it, fading in offices where his ideas were taken and credited to louder voices, fading in streets where crowds brushed past him like he was fog, fading even in his own home where mirrors reflected a body that looked present, but a spirit that felt hollowed out by quiet defeats. And every morning, he woke before the sun, not because he was disciplined or ambitious, but because sleep had become a battleground of memories, where every dream ended the same way, with him standing at the edge of something important while someone else stepped forward and claimed it. And he would wake with his heart racing and his fists clenched, already tired before the day began, and yet he still went on because quitting had never felt like a dramatic option, but rather a slow erosion of hope that he stubbornly resisted, even when he could no longer explain why. And the city he lived in was a steel and glass monster that rewarded speed, noise, and confidence, and he possessed none of those invisible excess, only a deep, unspoken endurance that no one celebrated because endurance does not shine. It simply survives. And he survived through humiliations that stacked like unpaid debts, through smiles that concealed contempt, through promises made to him that dissolved the moment they were spoken. And there were days when he questioned whether his life had any narrative at all, or whether he was merely background, texture in other people's stories, an extra in a film that would never roll credits for him. And yet on the night, everything changed. It began in the most ordinary way possible, with a walk home under flickering streetlights and the sound of distant sirens echoing like reminders that other lives were colliding with purpose, while his continued to drift, and it was there, beneath a broken lamp buzzing like an insect trapped in glass, that he saw something he was not supposed to see. A man lying half-conscious in the shadows, clutching a small, weathered notebook to his chest as if it were a vital organ. An instinct told him to keep walking, because involvement had never rewarded him before. But something deeper than instinct, something older and more dangerous, compelled him to stop. And when he knelt beside the stranger, their eyes met, and in that brief connection there was a recognition that felt impossible, as if the stranger knew him intimately despite never having seen him. And the man whispered with effort that sounded like it cost him years of life, "If you disappear now, you'll disappear forever," before pressing the notebook into his hands with a grip that was shockingly strong. And then the stranger collapsed fully, breath shallow, eyes rolling back, leaving him frozen with the weight of a choice he had avoided all. His life and sirens grew louder and footsteps approached. And in a moment that would later replay in his mind with brutal clarity, he ran, clutching the notebook to his chest, heart pounding not from fear of the law but from the terror of finally carrying something that mattered. And when he reached his apartment, a small, dim space filled with unfinished plans and second-hand furniture, he locked the door and sat on the floor, breathing like he had escaped a fire. And only then did he open the notebook, expecting addresses or secrets or something tangible. But what he found instead were sentences written in deliberate, almost cruel handwriting. Sentences that spoke directly to him, not generically but with surgical precision, describing his failures, his self-doubt, the moments he had chosen silence over resistance. And page after page forced him to confront the truth, that his life had not been stolen from him but surrendered inch by inch. And the words burned because they were accurate, because they articulated thoughts he had never dared to say aloud. And at the back of the notebook was a final line that altered the trajectory of his existence. "If you are reading this, you have one chance to become undeniable." And beneath it, a list of dates that extended into the future, each accompanied by a single instruction, simple but unsettling, instructions that required courage rather than talent, presence rather than permission. And as dawn broke through his window, he realized with a clarity that terrified him that this was not a gift but a test, that the universe had finally noticed him not to comfort him but to challenge him. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside his chest that was neither hope nor fear but resolve, the dangerous kind that does not ask whether success is guaranteed, only whether refusal is still acceptable. And as he stood and looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror, he understood that the man staring back at him was still invisible to the world, but no longer invisible to himself. And that realization, quiet and uncelebrated, was the opening crack in a life that was about to split wide open. Because the moment someone refuses to disappear, the world eventually has no choice but to notice. And if you are listening to this story right now, standing at the edge of your own quiet surrender, remember this moment. Because stories like this are not meant to be consumed and forgotten. They are meant to be followed. And if you stay, if you subscribe, if you walk through the next chapter with him, you may recognize parts of yourself that are still waiting to rise. The night Elias chose to return to the ruins, the wind moved like it remembered him, carrying whispers through the broken streets where the city once breathed. And every step he took felt heavier than the last, because this time he wasn't running from the past. He was walking straight into it, armed only with the truth he had finally accepted. In his chest. That pain does not disappear when you ignore it. It only grows teeth. So as the moonlight spilled over shattered towers and burned-out homes, Elias saw the echoes of who he used to be reflected in broken glass. A boy who believed silence could protect him. A man who learned too late that silence is what lets monsters win. And when he reached the center square where everything had ended years ago, the memories hit him like a storm with no warning. The screams, the fire, the moment he had turned away while others begged for help, a moment that had shaped every fearful decision since. And his hands shook not because he was weak, but because he was finally honest. Because courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move while fear is screaming at you to stop. And as shadows gathered between the pillars, they formed not creatures but reflections of his own failures, voices telling him he was too late, that redemption was a lie sold to fools, that the dead do not forgive. But Elias stood his ground and spoke aloud for the first time in years, admitting his guilt to the empty square, confessing not for forgiveness but for release. And something changed then, subtle but undeniable, as if the world itself leaned closer to listen. And from the darkness emerged Mara, not as the broken soul he remembered, but as something stronger, scarred yet unbowed. Her presence a living reminder that survival is an act of defiance. And she told him that the city didn't fall because people were weak. It fell because too many believed they were alone, because they waited for someone else to be brave first. And her words cut deeper than any blade because Elias knew she was right. And as dawn began to stain the sky with color, they walked together through the ruins, lighting fires where there had only been ash, signaling not just to survivors but to the idea of hope itself. And others came, drawn by the light, broken people with broken stories who still chose to stand. And in that moment, Elias understood that leadership isn't about power. It's about responsibility, about stepping forward when it would be easier to disappear. And the rebuilding began not with walls or weapons, but with voices, stories shared around the fire, wounds exposed so they could finally heal. And as days turned into weeks, the city breathed again. Not as it was, but as it needed to be, forged by those who refused to give up. And Elias no longer saw himself as the man who failed, but as the man who stayed, who learned that the past cannot be erased, but it can be transformed into purpose. And when he stood atop the highest tower watching the sun rise over a city reborn, he spoke not just to those below, but to everyone listening beyond the story, reminding them that if they had made it this far, if they were still listening, it meant something inside them refused to quit. That stories like this exist to remind us of our own strength, and that by choosing to stay, to watch, to be part of a growing community, they weren't just subscribing to a channel, they were choosing courage, choosing growth, choosing to rise again no matter how many times they had fallen.